On a September evening in 1999, Sylvia Quayle locked up her small bakery and drove home in her dark green sedan. She never made it. Hours later, volunteers and police combed the roads and forests, finding only one of her shoes and her purse discarded 3 miles from her route. No car, no body, no answers. The case went cold, but Bloomington never forgot. Then, nearly 20 years later, as Lake Monroe was dredged, workers unearthed the missing sedan. Its backseat held mud, bone, and a coat wrapped around secrets. And within those fibers, invisible to the naked eye, was the DNA of a man who had walked freely among the same streets, certain his crime had drowned with the car. Before we dive in this case, make sure to hit the subscribe button and like this video. Now back to the case. The heavy claw of the dredging machine rose slowly from the murky surface of Lake Monroe, dripping with silt and weeds. At first, workers thought they had snagged just another forgotten piece of scrap, maybe an old farm tool or a barrel long sunk beneath the water. But as the mass of mud and rust cleared the surface, the shape was unmistakable. A roof, a windshield, a car that had been buried in silence for nearly 2 decades. The workers shouted to one another, gathering along the shore as the crane pulled its burden higher. The vehicle was barely recognizable, its dark green paint eaten away, the windows shattered, the trunk sealed shut by layers of sediment. One of the men whispered the words everyone else was afraid to say. "It's been down there a long time." On the bank, deputies from the Monroe County Sheriff's Department stepped closer, their boots sinking into the wet earth. This wasn't the first time Lake Monroe had been searched for Sylvia May Quayle, the 27-year-old baker who vanished one September night in 1999. Her disappearance had been one of Bloomington's most haunting mysteries. The search back then had involved helicopters, bloodhounds, and hundreds of volunteers combing the roadside. All they had ever found was one of Sylvia's shoes and her purse, abandoned 3 miles from her route home. But the car, the key to the puzzle, had seemed to vanish into thin air. Until now. When the tow line finally lowered the rusted sedan onto the shore, investigators crowded around. It was Sylvia's dark green vehicle, the license plate barely legible beneath the corrosion. The back door creaked as they forced it open. Mud and lakeweed poured out, carrying with it something far more chilling, fragments of bone. Nestled in the muck was a light blue wool coat still wrapped around the remains, as if Sylvia had been frozen in her last desperate moment. For a few seconds, the scene was silent except for the lapping of water against the shore. One detective quietly removed his cap, bowing his head. Another turned away, unable to face the grim confirmation that Sylvia's journey had ended here, entombed beneath the lake for nearly 20 years. But there was something else. Hidden in the fibers of that coat, in the very threads stained with mud and time, was a clue no one could see with the naked eye. It wasn't visible to the workers who dredged the lake, or even to the deputies who bagged the evidence that day. Yet, years later, it would speak louder than any witness, louder than any rumor. It was DNA, an invisible trace left by someone who had been in that car with Sylvia on the night she vanished. Someone who had calculated to sink the sedan deep below Lake Monroe, confident that the crime would never resurface. As the car was loaded onto a flatbed and taken from the water's edge, the sun dipped low over Bloomington. The town had carried Sylvia's absence for nearly 2 decades, her family keeping vigil with candles and prayers each September. Now a door was opening, not to hope, but to a darker truth. The question was no longer what happened to Sylvia Quayle. It was who had been with her that night, and why had they believed Lake Monroe would keep their secret forever? September 17th, 1999, was a day that began as ordinary as any for Sylvia May Quayle. She had been up since dawn, flour dust on her sleeves, her small bakery in Bloomington buzzing with pre-wedding orders. It was wedding season, and Sylvia's cakes were in demand, the kind people drove across town for, 3-tier buttercream confections decorated with pressed flowers. She worked tirelessly, balancing her baking with the quiet routines of her life, content with the steady hum of ovens and the smell of vanilla. By the time she closed the shop, night had crept across Indiana. A steady drizzle had slicked the roads, and mist rolled low across the cornfields lining State Road 46. Sylvia, petite with her dark hair tucked beneath a headscarf, locked the bakery doors at 9:45 p.m. Her car, a dark green sedan, waited outside. Already familiar to the regulars who often saw her leaving with flour-streaked hands and tired eyes, She made a quick stop at a corner store before heading home. The clerk remembered her purchasing bottled water and a pack of gum, her smile polite but weary. Surveillance cameras, grainy in the late 90s, caught her walking out at 10:02 p.m., umbrella tucked under her arm. This would be the last confirmed image of her alive. Her drive should have taken only 20 minutes, straight down 46, past the patchwork of farmland and woodlots, then into her quiet neighborhood on the east side of town. But somewhere along that route, something went wrong. At 10:20 p.m., a farmer reported seeing headlights pulled to the side of the road near a stretch of dense woods. He thought little of it. Cars often stopped there, either from deer crossings or mechanical trouble. But when deputies retraced the account later, the description of the car matched Sylvia's sedan. By morning, Sylvia's absence was undeniable. She hadn't called her parents, who lived nearby, nor shown up to open her bakery. Customers waiting for pickups found the store dark, and by noon, her family was calling police. The first search parties fanned out within hours. Officers traced her likely path along State Road 46. Bloodhounds were deployed, their noses pressed into the wet earth as volunteers combed through brambles and brush. That's when they found the first sign, Sylvia's purse, lying on the roadside ditch 3 miles from her intended turnoff. Its strap was torn, the contents scattered, receipts, a compact, her bakery keys. A few yards further, tangled in the weeds, was one of her shoes, still damp from the rain. It was as if she had been snatched mid-step. The discovery chilled investigators. Purse and shoe meant struggle. Yet there were no skid marks, no signs of a crash, no trail of footprints leading away. The rain had washed away nearly everything. Neighbors recalled hearing nothing unusual, only the chorus of crickets and the hum of passing trucks on the highway. One truck driver later mentioned a dark vehicle stopped at the side of the road around 10:30, a man standing outside it. He assumed it was a flat tire. The man's description was vague, medium build, baseball cap, but it was enough to plant unease. As the hours stretched, search efforts intensified. Helicopters circled overhead with spotlights while volunteers lined fields shoulder to shoulder. Still no car, no Sylvia. It was as though both had been swallowed by the Indiana night. That evening, detectives gathered at headquarters with little more than fragments. A shoe, a purse, a second-hand sighting of a man. Families whispered the unthinkable. Had Sylvia been abducted? If so, by whom? What no one knew was that her dark green sedan was already sinking beneath the waters of Lake Monroe, pushed into its muddy depths before sunrise. It would rest there, sealed away with her secrets, for nearly 2 decades before resurfacing. But on that September night in 1999, as candles were lit on porches and families prayed for Sylvia's return, the crime was fresh, raw, and invisible. It was a vanishing act that left behind only questions that would haunt Bloomington for years to come. In missing persons investigations, the first 3 days are often described as the golden window. After 72 hours, evidence cools, leads fade, and memories blur. For Sylvia May Quayle, those first hours after her vanishing would prove both feverish and fruitless. By Friday morning, September 18th, police had already launched a full-scale search. Sylvia's family had sounded the alarm the previous evening, when she failed to return home and her bakery remained dark at dawn. Her mother's voice trembled as she told deputies, "She doesn't just not come home. Something's happened." Detectives took her disappearance seriously from the outset. Sylvia was a responsible 29-year-old with no history of running off. Officers canvassed her usual route, starting from the bakery and radiating outward along State Road 46. Volunteers combed fields, barns, and abandoned sheds. Bloodhounds sniffed through roadside ditches, circling back to the spot where her purse and lone shoe had been found. The discovery immediately shifted the tone of the case. It wasn't just a missing adult, it was potentially foul play. By noon, command posts were set up. Helicopters swept the highway corridor with infrared cameras, while search boats dragged parts of nearby streams and ponds. Every hour Sylvia remained missing added to the dread. The first 24 hours also brought the first wave of interviews. Detectives spoke with the last people to see her, the convenience store clerk who recalled her polite smile, the farmer who spotted headlights by the woods, and the truck driver who vaguely remembered a man near a stopped car. None of the witnesses had details sharp enough to move the case forward. Still, rumors took root. Some whispered of a green pickup truck trailing her. Others claimed to have heard shouting on the highway late at night. Reporters arrived in Bloomington by the afternoon, broadcasting images of Sylvia's purse and shoe, asking the public for tips. The Quayle family, devastated but determined, stood before cameras pleading for help. Her father's voice cracked. "Someone out there knows what happened to Sylvia. Please, if you've seen anything, call the police." By the second day, investigators widened their net. They interviewed friends, co-workers, even ex-boyfriends, combing through Sylvia's life for possible enemies. Nothing pointed to a motive. Everyone described her as kind, hardworking, devoted to her bakery and her family. She had no debts, no feuds, no dangerous habits. The lack of suspects frustrated detectives. Roadblocks were set up along 46 to question passing motorists. Tire tracks were photographed, but the rain had smudged most evidence into the mud. Forensic teams dusted her purse for prints, none usable. The shoe was examined but revealed no DNA beyond Sylvia's own. By the third day, fear in Bloomington hardened into grim reality. Flyers with Sylvia's face were taped to storefronts, utility poles, and church doors. Vigils were organized, hundreds gathering with candles along the courthouse square. The bakery, once filled with sweet smells and laughter, became a shrine of flowers and handwritten notes. "Come home, Sylvia." Privately, detectives knew the odds were dwindling. Statistically, if an abduction turned fatal, the critical harm often occurred within the first 48 hours. Each passing hour made the chance of finding Sylvia alive slimmer. Still, they pressed forward. Dive teams searched deeper waters of nearby ponds, dragging for signs of a vehicle. Nothing emerged. There was also the haunting question of her car. A dark green sedan doesn't just vanish, yet no one reported seeing it abandoned or towed. The highway surveillance cameras were too sparse in 1999 to track it. It was as if both Sylvia and her car had been swallowed by the earth. On the 72-hour mark, the investigation was running on adrenaline and fragments. Detectives sat in the Bloomington station, pinning leads on a corkboard already cluttered with maps, photographs, and phone records. None of it connected. One detective muttered what everyone feared: "If we don't get something soon, this is going cold." But in that moment, Sylvia's family refused to let go. They rallied volunteers for yet another search, hoping against hope that she was out there waiting to be found. The town leaned in with them, clinging to candlelight vigils and whispered prayers. No one knew that Sylvia's sedan lay hidden under 20 feet of murky water in Lake Monroe. No one knew that her body, wrapped in her blue coat, had already become part of the lake bed. For the investigators in those first 72 hours, all they had was silence and the sinking dread that Sylvia's story was slipping out of reach. Every major case seems to produce one lead that dominates the investigation, a thread detectives pull with relentless determination, only to discover it unravels into nothing. For Sylvia Quayle's disappearance, that lead came in the form of a man named David "Red" Connolly. Connolly was a 32-year-old mechanic who lived just outside Bloomington. He had a reputation around town: short temper, heavy drinking, and a history of bar fights. More importantly, he drove an older red pickup truck. Within the first week of Sylvia's disappearance, multiple witnesses claimed to have seen a red truck parked along State Road 46 the night she vanished. One woman even insisted she saw a young woman, possibly Sylvia, arguing with a man beside such a vehicle. To investigators desperate for traction, Connolly seemed to fit. He lived less than 10 miles from Sylvia's bakery, occasionally stopped in for coffee, and was known to make unwanted advances toward women. Co-workers described him as obsessive and said he had a habit of showing up uninvited at places where women worked late. Detectives moved quickly. They obtained a search warrant for his property, examining his truck inside and out. At first glance, the vehicle raised suspicion. Mud streaked across the undercarriage, a faint smell of bleach in the cabin, and fibers on the passenger seat that looked similar to Sylvia's coat. Investigators bagged everything. When word spread that police were focusing on Connolly, the community seized on it. The media headlined him as a person of interest, and whispers across town labeled him guilty before the evidence was even analyzed. For Sylvia's family, the development was bittersweet. Relief that there might be answers, but fear that it would lead to nothing. The problem was, the evidence simply didn't stick. Forensic testing revealed the fibers were common polyester, not linked to Sylvia's coat. The bleach smell was traced to a recent cleaning after Connolly spilled transmission fluid. The mud matched soil from his own property, not the area near where Sylvia's belongings were found. Even more damning to the theory Connolly's alibi held. On the night of Sylvia's disappearance, he had been drinking heavily at a local tavern. Multiple patrons and the bartender confirmed his presence until after midnight. Credit card receipts showed he paid his tab at 12:18 a.m., right around the time Sylvia would have been driving home. Detectives tried to poke holes in the story, questioning whether he could have left briefly. But surveillance footage from a nearby gas station placed his truck at a different location during the critical window. By November, Connolly was officially cleared. The announcement frustrated the public, who had already cast him as the villain. For investigators, it was a crushing setback. Weeks of energy, resources, and attention had been spent chasing a man who, for all his flaws, had nothing to do with Sylvia's disappearance. The case file ballooned with Connolly's records, interview transcripts, property searches, forensic reports, yet none of it moved the investigation closer to Sylvia. Detectives were forced to step back, regroup, and admit they were no nearer to finding her car or her body. For Sylvia's family, the emotional whiplash was brutal. They had gone from despair to cautious hope, to despair again. Her father voiced it bluntly at a press conference. They told us they had someone. Now they tell us they don't. How much longer can this go on? In truth, the red herring had done more than just mislead. It had eroded public confidence. Each cleared suspect, each false lead, left the impression that perhaps no one would ever be caught. That Sylvia had simply vanished into the night, leaving nothing but a shoe, a purse, and a hole in her family's life. The case, once ablaze with urgency, began to cool. Detectives still worked the phones, still chased down tips, but the momentum had shifted. Connolly's name faded from the headlines, and with it, the spotlight on Sylvia's case began to dim. For the first time since her disappearance, silence started to settle over Bloomington. It was a silence that would only deepen in the years to come, until the lake itself decided to speak. As the investigation into Sylvia Quayle's disappearance faltered, the weight of hope shifted to the community. Bloomington, a college town with a tightly knit heart, refused to let her name fade quietly into the backdrop of unsolved mysteries. From candlelight vigils to prayer circles, from posters taped on every shop window to nightly newscasts, Sylvia's face became a fixture of the town's collective grief. Within the first month, vigils were held in Courthouse Square, drawing hundreds of residents who had never even met Sylvia. They came carrying candles, whispering prayers, clutching photographs printed from the newspaper. Local pastors led hymns under the September sky, their voices breaking as they invoked her safe return. Volunteers passed out flyers, each one bearing her smiling face, beneath the simple headline, "Missing, help us bring Sylvia home." Media coverage was relentless in those early weeks. Local stations ran nightly updates, looping images of the green sedan, the shoe, the purse. Indianapolis-based reporters traveled south to cover the mystery, framing Sylvia's case as emblematic of a rising fear on quiet roads. National outlets briefly picked it up too, slotting it into the endless cycle of America's missing women. For a while, it felt as though the entire state was watching Bloomington. But as the months dragged on with no new leads, the tone shifted. What had once been urgent pleas began to feel like recycled segments. Reporters grew impatient with the lack of progress. Some coverage turned skeptical, questioning police competency, even hinting that Sylvia may have known her abductor. Each insinuation stung her family like salt in an open wound. For Sylvia's parents and siblings, the pressure was unbearable. Her father took on the role of spokesperson, appearing in interviews with trembling hands and hollowed eyes. He pleaded, sometimes angrily, sometimes in tears, "Please don't forget her. She's not just a headline. She's our daughter." His words struck home, but they also underscored the emotional toll of living in limbo. Community groups rallied in response. Sylvia's former classmates organized benefit dinners to raise funds for private investigators. Churches collected donations for expanded search efforts. Volunteers braved cold autumn mornings to retrace paths along State Road 46, though everyone knew the official searches had already scoured those areas. The symbolism mattered more than the likelihood of success. It was a way to show the family they weren't alone. Still, the lack of progress gnawed at Bloomington's spirit. Parents began warning their daughters not to drive home alone at night. Rumors swirled about strangers lurking in parking lots, unmarked vans, and men with too many questions. The red pickup truck sighting, though debunked, lingered in the community's imagination as a phantom threat. At the same time, detectives privately wrestled with the media glare. Each press conference brought new questions they couldn't answer, pressure to provide updates they didn't have. The inability to present a suspect or progress gradually eroded trust between investigators and the public. Some residents began whispering that the police weren't doing enough, that Sylvia had been forgotten behind closed doors. The Quayle family fought to resist that narrative. They organized annual prayer vigils on the anniversary of her disappearance. They lit candles, released balloons, and spoke her name aloud, making sure it didn't vanish into silence. Local radio stations played her favorite songs during the vigils, creating moments of shared mourning across the town. For the community, those rituals became both comfort and curse. Comfort, because they provided a way to grieve together. Curse, because each anniversary underscored the same harsh reality. Another year had passed with no answers. Behind the public displays of solidarity, a quieter truth settled in. The news crews began pulling back. Fewer flyers appeared in windows. Attendance at vigils thinned. What had once been front-page news slowly slid to the back pages, replaced by fresher stories. But within Sylvia's family, and within the hearts of a devoted few, the flame remained. They carried her memory in church pews, in whispered prayers before bed, in the fading photographs taped to refrigerator doors. They carried the unbearable knowledge that the person responsible was still out there, walking freely in their town, or perhaps hiding in plain sight. It would take nearly 20 years, and the advance of science itself, before that truth would finally be dragged from the shadows. By the spring of 2000, 6 months after Sylvia May Quayle's disappearance, the case files stacked in the corner of the Bloomington Police Department told a silent story of exhaustion. Interviews, search warrants, polygraph tests, tip line transcripts, page after page of work, yet none of it pointing to Sylvia's abductor. Detectives had followed every thread, from the purse found along State Road 46 to the reported green sedan seen near Lake Monroe. But each path ended in the same place, nowhere. The lead investigator, Detective John Ramirez, still started his mornings staring at the large wall map plastered with pins and red string. He often stood there longer than he realized, as if staring hard enough might make a new clue reveal itself. But the phone had stopped ringing with new tips. Volunteers had returned to their jobs and classes, and the once crowded search command post in the old firehouse now sat empty, its whiteboards ghosted with the faint outlines of erased notes. Officially, the department couldn't say they were giving up. The word was taboo, especially in a town still raw from unanswered questions. But privately, everyone understood the reality. Without a body, without a vehicle, without forensic evidence beyond a single shoe and a purse, the case had reached a standstill. The Quayle family resisted the shift with everything they had. Sylvia's mother, Ruth, showed up at the station with baked goods, quietly hoping her presence might remind investigators that her daughter was not just another file in a cabinet. Her father, Harold, wrote letters to the chief of police, insisting the case remain active. "If this were your child," he wrote once, "would you stop looking after 6 months?" The words landed with the weight of grief, but even grief couldn't produce new evidence. By the 1-year mark, the reality could no longer be delayed. The case was formally reclassified as a cold case. A short press release framed it in cautious language. "At this time, all active leads have been exhausted. The case remains open and unsolved. We ask that anyone with information, no matter how small, come forward." To the Quayle family, those words felt like a funeral without a body. The designation hit Bloomington hard. For some residents, it was the moment they accepted Sylvia was gone forever. For others, it sparked anger at the police, at the lack of answers, even at fate itself. Rumors reignited briefly. Whispers of truck drivers passing through, of disgruntled customers from the bakery, of boyfriends from Sylvia's past. Each rumor brought a flicker of hope, quickly extinguished when detectives confirmed there was nothing substantial behind them. The family refused to let her memory fade. They continued holding prayer vigils, but the crowds grew smaller each year. At the second anniversary, less than half the original group showed up. A local reporter who had once covered the case nightly now summarized it in a 200-word column buried in the middle of the paper. The silence was deafening. Inside the department, Sylvia's file was carefully boxed, labeled, and placed on a shelf in the cold case storage room. Detectives walked past rows of other unsolved tragedies: missing women, unidentified remains, unsolved homicides. Each box was a reminder of promises unfulfilled. Ramirez signed the paperwork with a heavy pen stroke. He told himself it wasn't the end, just a pause until new evidence emerged. But in his heart, he feared the case would sit untouched for decades. For the Quayles, the designation meant living in limbo. They kept Sylvia's bedroom intact, her light blue coat still hanging in the closet, not knowing it would one day resurface in the most haunting way. They left her name etched into prayers at church, into small-town conversations, into the aching space around the dinner table. Time marched forward, as it always does. The bakery Sylvia once ran quietly closed. Friends married, had children, and grew older. But for the Quayles, time had frozen on a September night in 1999. Every birthday, every holiday, every New Year was a reminder of the silence surrounding her, and somewhere beneath the waters of Lake Monroe, hidden under 20 feet of silt and darkness, the answers waited. For nearly 2 decades, Sylvia May Quayle's name existed only in memory and in a cardboard box filed on a dusty shelf in the Bloomington Police Department. Then, in the fall of 2018, fate shifted. Lake Monroe, swollen from summer storms, had begun to erode parts of its shoreline. The county scheduled dredging to clear debris and restore the waterway. It was supposed to be routine work, clearing stumps, scrap metal, the discarded remnants of decades. But what emerged from 20 feet below the surface was anything but routine. A rusted dark green sedan, barely holding together, was pulled from the depths. Its windows shattered long ago, the interior thick with mud and silt. As workers peered inside, a sight froze them. A faded light blue wool coat draped across the back seat, its fabric still clinging to skeletal remains. The van confirmed what the Quayle family had prayed and feared in equal measure. It was Sylvia's car. Detectives and forensic teams moved with renewed purpose. For the first time in 19 years, there was physical evidence, tangible proof that Sylvia's disappearance had not been voluntary, not an accident. Someone had deliberately driven her car into the lake, ensuring it stayed hidden underwater in sediment. The remains were carefully recovered, along with fragments of bone and strands of hair preserved by the silt. But it was the coat that became the focus. Forensic scientists treated it like a sacred object. Within the fibers, they discovered a mixture of DNA profiles. One was Sylvia's, the other belonged to an unknown male. In 1999, this discovery would have been nearly useless. CODIS could only match if the suspect's DNA was already in the system. But in 2018, technology had evolved. Detectives turned to a tool that had changed the landscape of cold case investigations: forensic genetic genealogy. The process was deceptively simple in description, though painstaking in execution. Scientists uploaded the unidentified male DNA to genealogical databases used by people searching for relatives and ancestry. From there, software built partial family trees identifying distant cousins and great-grandparents. With careful triangulation, genealogists could narrow the scope until a handful of names remained. Detective Ramirez, now a retired consultant brought back to assist, called it science catching up to the crime. The unknown profile wasn't just a random sequence of letters anymore. It was a breadcrumb trail leading to someone who had lived, who had a family, who thought they had escaped detection. Weeks turned into months as genealogists worked the tree, cross-referencing names with Indiana birth records, employment histories, and known addresses around Bloomington in 1999. Slowly, one name began to rise above the rest: a man who had lived less than 5 miles from Sylvia's bakery. A man who had been questioned briefly back then but dismissed because he had no reason to be a suspect. For the Quayle family, the phone call came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. After nearly 20 years of silence, investigators told them they had found Sylvia's car, her remains, and, most importantly, an unidentified DNA profile. Her brother, Michael, later said, "For the first time, I felt like my sister's voice had been heard again. The lake had given up its secret. Science had given it context. And the case, once considered frozen in time, began to move again, with a pace and momentum no one in Bloomington could have expected. When investigators pieced together the family tree from the unidentified male DNA, the branches all led back to one root, a man who had never left Bloomington. His name was Harold Dean Mercer. At 64, he looked like any other lifelong Midwestern resident. He worked maintenance jobs, attended church twice a month, and shopped at the same grocery store as the Quayle family. He was the kind of man you'd nod to in the hardware aisle, the neighbor who offered to lend a ladder, the face you stopped noticing because it had always been there. Back in 1999, Harold lived less than 5 miles from Sylvia's bakery. He had no violent criminal record, only minor citations for traffic violations. Detectives had spoken to him briefly during the original investigation when he mentioned stopping at a gas station near State Road 46 the night Sylvia disappeared. With no evidence linking him to her, he was crossed off the list. For nearly 20 years, Harold managed to remain invisible in plain sight. He married, divorced, and lived quietly in a small rental home near the edge of town. People described him as quiet, polite, and unremarkable. That ordinariness became his camouflage, but the genealogical trail did not lie. When investigators mapped out family connections, Harold's DNA emerged as the closest possible match. With further testing, the probability that it belonged to anyone else dwindled to near zero. Detective Ramirez later explained the moment the name surfaced on his desk. It's one thing when science gives you a stranger's name, but when it's someone who's been under your nose the whole time, it feels like the ground shifts beneath you. Investigators began discreet surveillance. They wanted to be absolutely certain before moving in. Harold's routines were ordinary: coffee at 7 a.m., errands around town, evenings at home watching television. Nothing about him screamed danger or guilt. Yet in those unremarkable patterns, detectives saw the face of a man who might have carried a terrible secret for 2 decades. Old neighbors recalled seeing Harold's green pickup truck parked on their street in the late 90s. A former co-worker remembered him showing up to work late the day after Sylvia disappeared, smelling faintly of lake water. Little details that seemed inconsequential at the time now took on chilling significance. The revelation rippled quietly through the investigative team. Some officers had grown up in Bloomington. They knew Harold. One had sat 2 pews behind him in church for years. Another had bought tools from him at a garage sale. To think that Sylvia's abductor, and likely her killer, had lived among them, exchanging polite greetings while her family held vigils, was almost unbearable. Meanwhile, the Quayle family received the news with a mixture of relief and devastation. Sylvia's brother Michael struggled with the idea. He wasn't a monster in a movie. He was someone you'd pass on the street and forget 2 seconds later. That's what makes it so terrifying. Harold himself seemed oblivious to the tightening noose. He continued mowing his lawn, making small talk with neighbors, and shopping at the local grocery store. All the while, investigators were gathering everything they needed to confirm the science. His DNA. The town of Bloomington had always whispered about Sylvia's disappearance, but now the whispers took on sharper edges. People who had known Harold, or thought they knew him, started to re-examine their memories. The quiet man at the edge of the community suddenly looked different under the light of suspicion. The DNA breakthrough had pointed to a name, but capturing Harold Mercer would require proof the courts couldn't deny. And that meant investigators needed to get what Harold had unknowingly left behind every day of his life. A fresh sample of his DNA. The man who had hidden in plain sight for nearly 20 years was about to face science he could no longer outrun. Once investigators had Harold Dean Mercer in their sights, science gave them probabilities, but the courts demanded certainty. The partial DNA profile from Sylvia Quayle's coat matched genealogical relatives and narrowed to Harold. But detectives knew a defense attorney would shred the case without a direct, uncontaminated sample from him. That meant they had to collect his DNA without tipping him off. Detective Ramirez assembled a small task force for surveillance. For weeks they followed Harold's unremarkable routines. He was a creature of habit: morning coffee from the same gas station, trips to the hardware store, evenings in front of his television. He never strayed far from his neighborhood. That predictability worked to their advantage. The first opportunity came at a diner just off State Road 46. Harold sat alone in a booth, eating scrambled eggs and sipping coffee. An undercover officer, seated a few tables away, waited as Harold finished. When he left, his utensils and coffee cup were whisked away not to the dishwasher, but into an evidence bag. The items went straight to the state crime lab, where technicians carefully swabbed the rim of the cup and the fork's tines. A week later, the results came back. Degraded, inconclusive. Not enough DNA to make a definitive call. The frustration in the task force room was palpable, but they didn't give up. 2 days later, Harold went to the grocery store. Detectives shadowed him down the aisles, pretending to shop. When he left the parking lot, an officer retrieved a cigarette butt he'd flicked near his car. Again, the lab swabbed it. Again, hopes soared. And again, the sample was too contaminated to yield a full profile. Detective Ramirez pushed his team harder. "We're close. We just need him to slip, just once." That slip came one warm September evening. Harold attended a minor league baseball game at the local field. He bought a soda, a hot dog, and settled in behind third base. Undercover officers, scattered nearby, waited patiently. Halfway through the game, Harold set his soda cup beneath his seat, ice melting in the bottom. When the crowd rose for the 7th-inning stretch, Harold shuffled off toward the restrooms. In that brief window, an officer slid down the row, snatched the cup, and sealed it in an evidence bag beneath his jacket. By the time Harold returned, cheering resumed, and he never noticed. This time, the lab's work paid off. The DNA extracted from the straw was pristine. Within days, the analysts confirmed it. The profile was a perfect match to the DNA found on Sylvia Quayle's coat recovered from the submerged sedan. When Detective Ramirez got the call, he closed his eyes and exhaled. 20 years of silence had ended with a discarded soda cup. The team gathered in their cramped briefing room, a mixture of triumph and disbelief settling over them. On the projector screen, the words were plain. Match probability, 1 in 9.3 quintillion. Source, Harold Dean Mercer. The case that had haunted Bloomington for decades had finally, scientifically, pointed to its answer. Now, the question was no longer if Harold had been there that night with Sylvia. The question was how to confront a man who had hidden behind ordinariness for 2 decades and bring him into a courtroom where truth could no longer be drowned beneath the waters of Lake Monroe. The call came just after dawn. The lab's final report was in. The soda cup collected at the ball game had yielded a pristine sample. Cross-checked against the DNA retrieved from Sylvia Quayle's blue wool coat, the conclusion was unshakable. DNA profile matches 100%. Detective Ramirez gathered his team in the Bloomington police station's briefing room. For a moment, no one spoke. 2 decades of frustration, dead ends, and fading hope hung in the air, giving way to stunned silence. Then quietly, Ramirez said what everyone was thinking. "It's him. We've got him." The district attorney moved quickly. A judge signed the arrest warrant, and by mid-morning, a tactical plan was in motion. Harold Dean Mercer, 61 years old, was about to face the knock he never thought would come. Officers staged quietly outside Mercer's modest ranch-style house on the edge of town. His neighborhood was the picture of suburban calm. Neatly trimmed hedges, kids' bikes in driveways, sprinklers ticking across green lawns. None of his neighbors had any idea that the man who lived among them, who waved politely while mowing his lawn, was accused of hiding a deadly secret for 20 years. At 7:15 a.m., 2 unmarked vehicles rolled to a stop in front of the house. The lead officer's voice rang out. "Harold Mercer." "Police, open the door!" Curtains shifted in nearby homes as residents peered out, startled by the commotion. Moments later, Mercer appeared in the doorway. Wearing a faded flannel shirt, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and resignation. "Mr. Mercer," Detective Ramirez said evenly. "Stepping forward, you're under arrest for the murder of Sylvia May Quayle, for the first time in decades." Mercer's composure slipped. His face drained of color, his hand tightened on the doorknob. But he said nothing as officers cuffed him and read him his rights. He shuffled into the squad car, the neighborhood watching in stunned silence. The ordinary man next door was being taken away for a crime that had cast a shadow since 1999. News spread across Bloomington within hours. Local headlines screamed, "Arrest made in 1999, Quayle cold case," and "DNA leads police to suspect after 20 years. At the Quayle family home, Sylvia's brother Daniel wept as he spoke to reporters. "We prayed for this day, but we never knew if it would come. Now we finally have a chance at justice for Sylvia." The arrest shook the community to its core. For years, Mercer had blended seamlessly into the backdrop of town life. He volunteered occasionally at the farmer's market, shopped at the local hardware store, and attended church potlucks. He was unremarkable in every way. That was his disguise. Yet science had uncovered what silence, secrecy, and time had tried to conceal. A single soda cup, thrown away carelessly, had broken open the walls Mercer had built for himself. As Ramirez drove home that night, exhaustion pressing on his shoulders, he passed the old site of Sylvia's bakery. It had long since changed hands, the sign repainted, the window displays different. But in that quiet moment, he thought of Sylvia's light blue coat, preserved in darkness beneath Lake Monroe, waiting to tell its story. And now it had. The arrest was not the end, but it was a beginning. After 20 years, the case that once seemed destined to remain in shadows had been pulled into the light. And a community long haunted by questions finally knew the name of the man accused of stealing one of their own. Inside the Bloomington Police Department, Harold Dean Mercer was led into a stark interview room. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a recording camera glowing red in the corner. His wrists were uncuffed, but his shoulders were tense, his hands clasped tightly as though bracing for a storm he could no longer outrun. Detective Ramirez entered with a calm, practiced presence. He laid a thick case file on the table, but didn't open it right away. He let the silence settle, the weight of 20 years pressing down on Mercer. "Harold," Ramirez began, his voice even, "we know you were with Sylvia Quayle the night she disappeared." Mercer shifted, his jaw tightening. For the first 20 minutes, he denied everything. He hadn't seen Sylvia, he didn't know her, he had no idea why he was there. His words tumbled out, rehearsed, defensive. Then Ramirez slid a single photograph across the table, the light blue wool coat, water-stained and fragile, recovered from the back seat of the submerged sedan. "This was Sylvia's. We found your DNA on it." Mercer's face faltered. He leaned back, swallowed hard, and for the first time his eyes flickered downward. He knew science had trapped him. Still, he tried to wriggle. "Maybe I brushed against her somewhere," he muttered. "Town's not that big." But Ramirez didn't flinch. "Your DNA was on the inside of her coat sleeves, Harold. That doesn't happen by accident." The silence that followed stretched long. Finally, Mercer exhaled and muttered, "I never meant for it to happen like that." Bit by bit, through fragmented sentences, a partial picture emerged. Mercer admitted he had followed Sylvia after she closed her bakery that night in September 1999. He told detectives he'd just wanted to talk, but when she rebuffed him, things spiraled. Then came the detail investigators had never released to the public, an anchor fact only Sylvia's killer could know. "She dropped her keys in the gravel," Mercer said, eyes unfocused. "She bent down to grab them, and that's when—" He stopped, clamping his mouth shut, realizing too late he'd revealed knowledge no one else had. Ramirez quietly noted the confession. In the original 1999 scene report, officers had found Sylvia's car keys in the gravel lot near the bakery's back entrance. That detail had never been published, never mentioned in the media. Mercer had just tied himself to the moment of abduction. He didn't confess outright to murder. Instead, his words twisted, shifting blame. He spoke of panic, of fear, of a mistake that went too far. But the evidence was clear, and his own slip had sealed it. After hours of questioning, Mercer slumped in his chair, drained. "It's been eating me alive," he whispered. "Every time I saw her family in the news. Every candlelight vigil. I thought maybe they'd stop looking." Ramirez gathered the files, his voice steady. "They never stopped, Harold. And neither did we." When Mercer was finally escorted back to his holding cell, Ramirez stood alone in the empty interview room. He looked at the photograph of Sylvia's coat, the fabric that had carried her warmth 2 decades ago, and now carried the truth of her last moments. The unreleased detail about her keys, now spoken aloud by the man in custody, was the missing piece investigators needed. Bloomington's long shadow was lifting. And with Mercer's words on record, the Quayle family could finally begin to piece together what had happened on that September night in 1999. When the news of Harold Mercer's arrest broke, investigators knew they had one final duty before the case could move toward trial: to return Sylvia May Quayle home. For nearly 20 years, her family had lived in limbo. No grave to visit, no certainty of her fate. The rusted sedan from Lake Monroe had given them fragments, but the bones and belongings needed careful identification and respectful return. The remains recovered from the back seat were transferred to the Indiana State Forensic Lab. Forensic anthropologists cataloged every fragment, confirming through dental records and DNA comparison that they belonged to Sylvia. Her light blue wool coat, once heavy with lake water and mud, was carefully cleaned and preserved. For the Quayle family, that coat was no longer just evidence. It was the last piece of Sylvia they could hold. Detective Ramirez asked Sylvia's brother Daniel if he wanted to be present when her remains were released. Daniel didn't hesitate. On a cool October morning under a pale gray sky, he and his mother walked into the coroner's office. The coroner handed them a small, polished wooden box containing Sylvia's remains. Daniel held it close to his chest, tears running down his face. "It's not the way we ever wanted her to come home," he said softly. "But she's home." The family organized a memorial service at the same church where Sylvia had been baptized as a child. The bakery she once ran sent trays of cookies and bread, baked by the new owners in her honor. More than 300 people filled the pews. Friends, neighbors, old classmates, even retired officers who had worked her case back in 1999. They lit candles, sang hymns, and told stories about Sylvia's laughter, her generosity, and her unshakable work ethic. Outside, a line of candles flickered along the church steps, each one representing a year she had been missing, 19 in total. During the service, Detective Ramirez sat quietly in the back. He had attended dozens of memorials in his career, but this one was different. For the first time, he could feel the weight of an answer given, the circle closing. It wasn't justice yet, that would come in court, but it was closure. Afterward, Daniel approached Ramirez and handed him something. It was a photograph of Sylvia standing in front of her bakery, flour dusting her apron, her smile bright. "Keep this," Daniel said. "You gave her back to us. She should stay with you too." Ramirez tucked the photo into his case file, a reminder of why cold cases mattered, why patience, science, and persistence mattered. In the weeks that followed, the Quayle family finally laid Sylvia to rest in Bloomington's Rose Hill Cemetery. Her grave was marked with a simple stone: Sylvia May Quayle, 1972-1999. Beloved daughter, sister, friend. Finally home. Community members visited often, leaving flowers, letters, and even loaves of bread, tributes to the baker whose life had touched so many. Closure did not mean forgetting. The pain lingered, but now it had a place to rest. No more unanswered questions. No more endless searching. For the Quayle family, the act of burying Sylvia was both heartbreak and healing. It was the moment they could finally exhale after 2 decades of holding their breath. And for the town of Bloomington, it was proof that even the darkest secrets buried beneath a lake could not stay hidden forever. The arrest of Harold Mercer had stunned Bloomington, but the courtroom would become the place where shock gave way to resolution. Nearly a year after his arrest in the fall of 2021, the trial of State of Indiana versus Harold D. Mercer began at the Monroe County Courthouse, just blocks away from where Sylvia once ran her bakery. For weeks leading up to the trial, the town buzzed with speculation. Reporters camped outside the courthouse steps, their cameras trained on every face that walked inside. The case had been dormant for 20 years, but now it carried the weight of history. For the Quayle family, the trial was not about spectacle. It was about finally hearing Sylvia's story told in full. The prosecution's case. Deputy Prosecutor Ellen Vargas opened with a haunting line. "This case is about a young woman who left her bakery one night in 1999 and never came home, because the man sitting before you made sure of it." The prosecution laid out the evidence meticulously. Jurors saw photographs of the rusted sedan pulled from Lake Monroe, its interior caked with silt. They listened to forensic experts explain how mud preserved DNA traces on Sylvia's coat for nearly 2 decades. They saw charts showing the genealogical research that had narrowed down Mercer's identity, culminating in the covert DNA collection from his discarded coffee cup. When the state DNA analyst testified that the odds of Mercer's DNA being present in Sylvia's car by coincidence were 1 in a quadrillion, the courtroom fell silent. Numbers didn't lie. The defense's strategy, Mercer's defense team attempted to sow doubt. They argued the DNA could have been transferred through secondary contact, that Mercer might have lent someone his coat years ago, or that Sylvia's car had been contaminated. They painted him as a hard-working family man, a respected electrician who had no criminal record, but the jury didn't buy it. Every defense theory crumbled under cross-examination. Mercer's alibi from the night of Sylvia's disappearance was vague, unsupported, and the fact that he had lived just a few miles from her bakery in 1999 tied him to the scene in ways coincidence could not explain. Family testimony. The most emotional moment came when Daniel Quayle took the stand. He spoke of the endless nights waiting for Sylvia to come home, the empty seat at family dinners, the candles lit at annual vigils. "We never stopped looking," he told the jury, his voice breaking. "And now we know why we couldn't find her, because he buried her where no one could." Jurors dabbed at their eyes. Even Mercer, sitting rigid in his chair, avoided Daniel's gaze. The verdict. After 2 weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The room was so still that even the shuffle of papers echoed. Judge Harriet Cole asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a verdict. "Yes, Your Honor." The words that followed were simple, but they carried the weight of decades. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Harold D. Mercer, guilty of murder in the first degree." Gasps filled the room. Daniel wrapped his arm around his mother, who wept quietly. Detective Ramirez exhaled, his shoulders finally lowering after years of carrying Sylvia's ghost. Sentencing. Weeks later, during sentencing, Judge Cole addressed Mercer directly. "You lived freely for 20 years while Sylvia's family lived in torment. This court will not allow you another day of freedom." She sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the Quayle family, it was not joy they felt, but a profound sense of release. Justice had come, not swiftly, not easily, but at last. As Mercer was led away in shackles, Daniel whispered to his mother, "It's over. She can rest now." The courtroom emptied, but the echoes of the verdict lingered in the hearts of everyone present. Bloomington had waited 22 years for this moment, and justice had finally answered. The gavel fell for the last time in Harold Mercer's trial, but Sylvia Quayle's story did not end in the courtroom. In many ways, it was only then that her legacy began to shine. For her family, the verdict brought a measure of peace, but also an ache that would never fully heal. Sylvia's mother, Ruth, spoke softly outside the courthouse. "Justice came late, but it came. We lit candles for 20 years, and now I believe Sylvia can finally see the light herself." Those words captured the bittersweet truth. Justice delayed is still justice. But no verdict could bring Sylvia back. The community of Bloomington embraced Sylvia's memory in tangible ways. Former customers of her bakery began organizing an annual Sylvia's Sweets fundraiser, where proceeds supported scholarships for local culinary students. Tennessee Williams once wrote that memories live longer than people, and in Sylvia's case, her passion for baking, her warmth with customers, and her devotion to family became the threads woven into the fabric of Bloomington. Law enforcement, too, reflected on what the case meant. Detective Luis Ramirez, who had stood by the Quayle family through years of silence, credited advances in DNA and forensic genealogy as the turning point. "Without technology," he admitted, "we might still be staring at a cold file in a dusty cabinet. But the truth was always there. It just needed time to be heard." His words resonated far beyond Monroe County. Across the nation, cold case detectives took renewed hope from Sylvia's story. The use of forensic genealogy had changed the landscape of justice. What once seemed impossible, solving decades-old crimes with fragments of evidence, was now becoming reality. And Sylvia's case joined a growing list that showed how science, persistence, and compassion could finally give victims their voice back. For Daniel Quayle, Sylvia's brother, the closure came not just from the guilty verdict, but from knowing the world would not forget her. "My sister wasn't just a case file," he said. "She was someone who loved, who dreamed, who baked wedding cakes with extra icing because she knew people smiled when they tasted sweetness. And I'll carry that memory, not the crime, with me forever." Bloomington, once haunted by whispers of Sylvia's disappearance, began to move forward. But each September, on the anniversary of her vanishing, the courthouse steps are lined with candles. Students, families, detectives, and even strangers gather, not just to remember Sylvia, but to remind each other that no one should disappear without answers. And so, Sylvia's story becomes more than tragedy. It becomes a reminder of resilience, of faith in justice, and of the families who never stop fighting for their loved ones. It is a story for every community holding unanswered questions, and for every detective staring at an old file late at night, wondering if it's worth one more look, because Sylvia's case proves that the answer is yes. It's always worth another look. If you've followed this journey, consider honoring Sylvia's memory by supporting organizations dedicated to solving cold cases and helping families of the missing. Share their stories, keep the light alive, and remember, even when justice comes late, it still matters. Sylvia's legacy teaches us that silence does not mean forgotten. And though her life ended far too soon, her story continues to inspire. Justice came at last. And justice, however delayed, is still justice.